Salt and Sacrifice is a 2D Souls-like from the one-man team at Ska Studios. A follow-up to the breakout success, Salt and Sanctuary, Sacrifice builds everything up from the ground up for a new experience for fans of the first game. There is an incredible amount of quality work present in the game for being developed by just one person. But Souls-likes require an intricate balance of its challenges and the tools available for players to overcome them. So how well does Salt and Sacrifice pull it off and iterate on its predecessor? And before we begin, just know that for this video, I'll only be using footage from the first 2 areas of the game, and the hub camp to keep from spoiling things later on. First, as always, let's take a look at the game's technical aspects. The game runs very steadily, with my 2090 maintaining a solid 60 FPS regardless of how many enemies and particle effects were on the screen at once. The game also never crashed, and I had 0 to no latency when playing online multiplayer. I also spent the majority of my time playing with a mouse and keyboard. Playing in that way actually worked really well thanks to the 2D perspective, but some of its UI elements and menus could be frustrating. Not only are most control prompts still displayed for an Xbox controller when using a mouse and keyboard, but there are also elements that will plainly be wrong. For example, when leveling up, the menu will say that you have to click to level up, but you actually have to use the D key to raise your level and then press space to accept it. The incorrect elements aren't a big deal, but they do make certain actions more annoying than they really should be. The story of Salt and Sacrifice begins with the player traveling to a new world as an inquisitor sent there to hunt down and kill the mages corrupting the land with magic. As you arrive, your carriage is attacked, requiring you to fight a massive boss that is intended to wipe the floor with you pretty quickly. You then wake up in a small camp with new NPCs, which acts as your central hub moving forward. As you play through the game, you can unlock new NPCs to stay at the camp, unlocking new areas and functions like multiplayer factions, your own customizable tent, and further upgrades for your gear. From the camp, you can travel to the game's various regions, using a portal activated by placing runes in a specific order. The regions throughout the game each have their own unique layouts and themes, as well as matching enemies and encounters. As you travel through them, you also collect new pieces of gear like grapple hooks that allow you to reach new areas and re-explore new parts of older areas. This is a tried and true structuring from Metroidvania games that works really well in Salt and Sacrifice. Exploring new areas is tense, but very rewarding, and returning to an old area to discover what you couldn't see there before is a ton of fun. However, the structuring of the areas is a bit disappointing. In Salt and Sanctuary, the game's areas all blended into one another in a natural progression, filled with shortcuts and a complicated web of connections. This new structure is definitely more approachable, but it also makes Sacrifice's world feel more disjointed and segregated. Some areas do have connections to others that aren't accessible with the portal in your camp, but these don't have nearly the same intricate design or network of connections as the areas in the previous game did. Some players may very well prefer this more traditionally defined structure, but I couldn't help but feel that it detracted from the atmosphere and pacing of Salt and Sacrifice overall. At the start of the game, players get to customize their character. This includes some basic hair and skin options, a starting item accompanied by a cryptic description, and selecting your starting class. The character creation is pretty standard, but does an admirable job of helping players pick which part of the game's combat mechanics they are most interested in, at least at first. As you play, you can equip any weapon or armor as long as you meet the requirements, so choosing a class is more about determining your starting gear rather than locking you into a certain line of unlockable skills or abilities. This is great, because each weapon type in Salt and Sacrifice offers players a new moveset and choices to tackle the game's challenges with. I favored using high blades, with medium armor and a crossbow. This allowed me to attack quickly and use my weapon's alternate attack to deliver a quick flurry of strikes to enemies, let me roll to avoid hits decently, and let me deal solid damage from a distance. However, my friend that I played with instead went with a tower shield, heavy armor, a spear, and a two-handed sword that he could switch to. This allowed him to not worry about rolling as much since he could block hits or keep smaller enemies at a distance with his spear. Then, when he really needed high damage to take out a boss or mage, he could switch to his sword instead. The variation in the game is impressive, and it all is also remarkably well balanced. Bosses have a variety of weaknesses to figure out and adapt your equipment to if you're having a hard time, while the regular enemies in the game are also varied enough to keep you on your toes. With my high blade, shielded enemies that could block a strike and get in close before I could react were very challenging, while my friend had a harder time with ranged or quicker enemies that were able to punish his slowness. Salt and Sacrifice also gives players a myriad of consumables to take advantage of as well. There are the genre standard healing potions, called Heartland Flasks here, elemental bombs, and items that grant the player various buffs. All of these have to be either crafted or purchased from a vendor. There is no resting at an obelisk, breed bonfire, and getting free healing. However, the game does most of the crafting automatically when you rest, cutting down on the already lengthy time it can take to grind hardened flasks or arrows after losing to a boss a couple times. As players kill enemies and progress through the game, they gather salt and silver, which can both be used to upgrade their character and purchase or upgrade gear. Everything can be upgraded with the right materials, whether it's your armor and weapon, your hardened flask, or even your arrow damage. The upgrades create a great feedback loop for overcoming the game's challenges, and keeping an eye out for the rarer resources you need helps make exploration much more exciting than it otherwise would be. Similar to Sanctuary, players in Sacrifice can also spend their salt to level up their characters, giving them black and white orbs to spend in a sprawling web of a skill tree. This system is arguably the worst part of Sacrifice's progression systems, so I want to take some time breaking it down, and looking at what about it doesn't quite work. As I just mentioned, the skill tree is a massive web, with paths of skills that branch off and connect to one another haphazardly throughout it. Every character has the same web of nodes, and different sections of it are associated with different gear and weapons that the developer has grouped together. So there is an area of nodes that focus on strength-related weapons, one that focuses on luck-related weapons, and so on. Most of the nodes in the web increase your character's base stats, like your strength or luck, by a few points. Other nodes give you the ability to access higher tiers of gear, as weapons and armor are classified into their type and a tier, to only allow players that have invested in that gear type to be able to equip better versions. This is where the first problem with the system arises. I was unlocking nodes for tier 3 high blades, crossbows, and medium armor before I had even found a full set of tier 2 armor or a tier 1 high blade. At that point, I was getting those nodes just because I had to get any other stat nodes that would actually be useful at the time. It is possible that this system is intended to push the player into diversifying their builds, by having a second type of weapon to switch to that they also want to invest toward in the web. But that also leads to the second and biggest problem of this system. Salt and Sacrifice positions itself as a game that allows you to approach its challenges however you wish. It isn't like The Witcher, which makes players fight like an actual Witcher, or Pillars of Eternity, where each class you select has a very specific role to play on the battlefield. But instead of giving the player the freedom to build their character however they wish, they are trapped into spending resources on nodes that they either aren't interested in or can't even use yet, making most level ups feel disappointing and boring. Beating a boss feels great, but it would feel even better if I could use the salt from beating it to level up a stat I actually cared about, rather than one I don't need or unlocking a tier of gear that I haven't even gotten close to finding. However, Salt and Sacrifice does do an exceptional job with its multiplayer. Players are given a handful of items that allow them to summon others for help, offer to go help others, opt into PvP, and send players off when you don't want them in your world anymore. Even better though, is the option to be match-made directly with a friend. One of my biggest complaints in most Souls-likes is how difficult it is to share the experience with a friend, and make builds that complement one another because you either have to grind excessively for items, have to roll the dice being summoned each time, or have to constantly rejoin the game whenever either one of you dies. Sacrifice takes a much more co-op friendly approach. Once a player is in your game, they don't leave until one of you wants to be done. If a player goes down, they can be revived on the spot by the other player, or when they go back to an obelisk. Otherwise, if both players die, they just respawn back at the most recent obelisk, like you normally do when playing alone. The numerous options players have for builds also allow co-op players who plan on spending most of the game together to focus on covering each other's weaknesses. This allows you to divide and conquer when faced with a group of smaller enemies, as well as making sure that you have the ability to deal with any bosses that you come across. But let's take a really good look at those bosses, because this game is a Souls-like after all. The bosses in Salt and Sacrifice can be split into two categories, traditional bosses and mages. First, let's take a look at the traditional bosses, or ones that are just encountered as you explore the map. These bosses have a lot of variety in their design and movesets, but they are all just massive monstrosities. They offer a pretty fun challenge, but finding them tends to feel more like stumbling on them. The arenas of the traditional bosses just aren't marked in any way, so as you explore, you'll suddenly find yourself in a boss fight out of nowhere. This doesn't give you any chance to prepare for the first time fighting them, and often feels very abrupt and a bit disorienting. Then there are the mages. Mages are tracked down by first finding some residue somewhere in the area that they left behind. After you interact with that corpse, you will get the information about the mage, what type of element they control, what resources they will drop, and what tier difficulty it is. However, the tier of difficulty is pretty arbitrary, and does very little to actually communicate how difficult the fight will end up being, because it doesn't directly connect to anything. During my time with the game, I never came across a mage that wasn't doable immediately when I found the corpse. so the difficulty tier didn't serve much of a purpose, especially since I was killing tier 4 mages with tier 1 or 0 gear. When you start a mage hunt, you are given a streak of black smoke on the screen that generally points in their direction, so that you can track them. As you follow the path, you'll encounter the mage multiple times, allowing you to get a few hits in on them before the actual fight, as they summon unique enemies to slow you down. This process is a pretty neat idea, but it can feel more cumbersome than necessary because the paths tend to take you through the areas you literally just went through to start the hunt in the first place. Once you reach the end of the path, however, you get to face the mage himself. These fights tend to play out pretty similarly to the traditional bosses, but with a few extra annoyances. Firstly, the hitboxes of various projectile attacks that mages use are plain busted. Sometimes you'll dodge a projectile and your character model won't even make any contact with it, and it will still hit you. This can be particularly annoying because of the second annoyance: how many of the mage movesets can completely stun-lock the player and combo them straight to death off a single hit. One-shot moves are not anything new to Souls-likes or even this game, but they become even more frustrating when getting hit by a single bubble throws you into 3 other bubbles before the mage pounds you to death himself, as you just have to sit and watch powerlessly. The third annoyance is that killing a mage doesn't remove them from the game. This is because they have unique crafting ingredients to make elemental gear, which is really great and a fun system. But it also means that they will just randomly spawn across the map with some of their minions, suddenly dropping you into a big fight that might be in a small area that makes the fight even harder. The worst cases of this were the multiple times that I would be tracking a mage and would come to encounter them somewhere where another mage had spawned, flooding the area with an impossible amount of projectiles and summoned minions. Finally, there is the visual and audio design of Salt and Sacrifice. Overall, it's really solid. Some players may not like the visual style of Ska Studios' games because it is so intentionally rough and grimy, but it fits their titles extremely well. Salt and Sacrifice dials their trademark style back a bit from their other titles like The Dishwasher Dead Samurai, but it still accomplishes making enemies feel as gruesome as they should while communicating the dying, barren state of the world you're exploring. The game's audio design is also sufficient, with some standout themes for bosses and impactful sound effects for weapons. There are some sounds that feel a bit out of place here and there, but the majority of them fit really well, and they all work to immerse the player rather than interrupting their focus. Now, while I do have some complaints about Salt and Sacrifice overall, they are largely because of how much the game does right. There is so much clear love and skill poured into Salt and Sacrifice, and it does so much right that it ends up exaggerating its mistake. However, the few issues that the game has done very little to lessen my recommendation of Salt and Sacrifice. There is so much in the game to enjoy that fans of the previous game definitely won't be disappointed, and fans of the genre should definitely check it out when they get the chance. However, if you aren't into Souls-like games too much, or can easily become frustrated with imprecise hitboxes, you may want to hold off on this one. Thanks for checking out our review of Salt and Sacrifice. If you've played us, let us know what you think, and make sure to subscribe to catch all of our future reviews. Also, follow us on Twitch, where we stream at least every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central.